We'd like to welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us today. Before we begin, we'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners, custodians of the lands on which we are today, and pay our respects to the cultural elders of the past, present and emerging peoples. We acknowledge their spiritual connection to country. This update on Perth NRM's food security analysis for Western Australia is in its final year, having commenced in 2019. This webinar is to present our interim findings before we finalise the report in 2023 and pursue opportunities with stakeholders for policy change. The webinar will present findings to date from the WA food supply chain stakeholders who have had input and provides opportunity for those interested in the project wanting to add their input. Lead researcher is Dr. Peter Batt, who is presenting with me today. He has led the project's research, design and driven the input analysis. He's former head of Curtin's School of Agribusiness and now consultant to the United Nations Food and Agricultural Organisation in the food and agribusiness sectors. The research has been made possible with funding from the Federal Department of Agriculture Water through its National Landcare program. Now let's jump into the program and start with what we'll cover today, and we'll lead off with a bit about Perth NRM and this project. So, as said, we'll cover an overview of where Perth NRM's involvement sits, what food security is, the project, the rationale behind it, its methodology. We'll have a look at the findings from fruit and vegetable producers, fruit and vegetable retailers, meat and grain producers and meat retailers, then some stakeholder interviews that we conducted. We'll also talk to the limitations of the project, its conclusions and opportunities to contribute further. The report finalisation will round off with that will cover us its completion in June 23. Perth NRM. It's a not-for-profit, non-government organisation, works with land managers to improve capacity in managing the land, soil, water and environment that they use. Its vision is that we live in a thriving natural ecosystem with sustainable food production, and its purpose is to empower people to have a positive ecological impact. So how do we work? Perth NRM is one of 56 NRMs nationally. We support land management capacity building projects with funding from the National Landcare program, all tiers of government, federal, state and local, and philanthropic organisations. Projects are with land managers, community and property catchment ecosystem management, and we also monitor trends to inform improvement opportunities. So in relation to WA's food security, we approached the federal government in 2018 on declining trends in natural resources in WA. Also concerns over sustainable, profitable future for food security in WA. Perth NRM obtained a federal grant in 2018 through the National Landcare program to review suspected WA food security issue over 4 years, 2019 to 2023. The project itself was in 3 parts. Firstly was a WA situation analysis developed with Curtin in 2019. Secondly, we sought to inform and interview food supply chain stakeholders statewide, 2020 to 22. And in 2023, this year, we're consolidating the findings to report the findings to inform policy direction. The project itself, the situation analysis in 2019 showed declining trends that have become the rationale for the project. The challenge was then to design the research to see how the declines were affecting WA food supply chain stakeholders. Input was invited from WA food supply chain stakeholders on constraints being faced in their businesses on delivering sustainable, profitable future for food security in WA. Now let's look at the situation analysis.
Thank you, Graham. Well, let's first talk about some of the things that are actually happening within Western Australia, as this will give us some sort of indication and guidance as to the things that we need to consider in this food security review. I think we all acknowledge that in the first instance, the population of WA is growing, and with population increase comes an increasing demand for food. It's expected that the population by 2050 in Western Australia will be around 5.4 million people. That's an additional 2.9 million. And of course, that's going to have a substantial impact on the increasing demand for land and the increasing demand for water. However, in parallel, the population is also becoming more richer. And as the population becomes more wealthy, there is an associated or a parallel change in diet. Today, people are eating more and more meat, more fresh fruit and vegetables, and more foods containing fats and oils. So what that's doing is bringing about or transforming the food industry as we know it. Today, more and more of the grain that is being produced is actually being used to feed livestock. And that's putting more and more pressure on our natural resources as we try, of course, to produce more food to feed the growing population. We also need to acknowledge that agricultural productivity is anticipated to decline as a result of climate change within the state of Western Australia. In terms of average temperatures, we expect the average temperatures to be somewhere between 1.3 degrees higher, and that is going to have a significant detrimental impact on agricultural productivity. We also expect there to be a significant change in rainfall distribution across the state of Western Australia. Rainfall in the north of the state is likely to increase, but in the south of the state, rainfall is likely to decline by as much as 15%. But it's also the timing of when the rainfall occurs, with much more of the rain occurring now during summer, which can and will have, no doubt, a negative impact on both the quantity of production but also the quality of production. We also need to acknowledge, as a result of climate change and the volatility that we're seeing with climate, that we're going to have a much greater incidence of drought and of course a much greater incidence of severe weather events such as typhoons and cyclones, and of course the recent flooding that we've experienced both in the state but also nationally and indeed globally. We can also expect there to be a far greater incidence and a far greater severity of bushfires. Agricultural productivity will also decline as a result of diminishing natural capital. WA has some of the oldest soils on the planet. Our soils are particularly susceptible to wind and water erosion. We're also seeing increasing soil acidity and increasing soil salinity. We're also seeing increasing soil compaction, which has a negative impact, of course, on the capacity of air to enter the soil and indeed for water to enter the soil. And over time, more and more of the soils within Western Australia are becoming water repellent. We also need to acknowledge that water, as we've touched up already, is becoming more and more of a scarce resource. The competition for water between agricultural use, the environment, industrial and residential is increasing. But what we've also observed over time is that with the decline in the water aquifers, we're seeing more and more water drawn from our aquifers, which is likely to result in the intrusion of salt water, and as a result of that, a further decline then in the quality of the water that is available for farmers and other industrial and domestic uses. What we also need to appreciate is that agriculture is globally the leading cause for biodiversity loss. This occurs through the conversion, particularly of forest and pastures, towards animal production and food production. Biodiversity loss is significant, and it's widely acknowledged that certainly within the horticultural industries, for example, the loss of biodiversity is likely to have a significant negative impact on productivity through, for example, the pollination services that are provided by insects. We also need to acknowledge WA's isolation and the supply chain impediments that will impact and influence the state. Our research indicates that approximately 46% of the food that is consumed within WA is imported, And yet Western Australia is a major exporter of grains, of meat, of fish, and of fresh fruit and vegetable products. And of course, let's not forget the wine industry. But the challenge here is that consumers are purchasing convenient, packaged foods, and food processing in Western Australia is very, very low. Our dependence then on processed and manufactured food products is having a significant negative impact then on food security within the state of Western Australia. And we have increasingly experienced this as a result, of course, of flooding on the Nullarbor and, of course, post-COVID, some of the supply chain disruptions that we've seen as a result of food safety breakdowns and labour shortages in the food processing industry.
Thanks for that, Peter. That certainly shows us that the changes in so many factors affecting us need to be considered carefully and collectively. Even though the business and community in our food supply chain are very resilient and some of the best adaptive managers there are, each of us has our own level of resilience with fracture points for many evident in this research. So now we need to understand food security. Many of us think of food security as a third world or country problem. So Peter, can you please show us what the need is to move the discussion beyond third world countries to recognise that food security is our problem too?
Indeed, and thank you, Graham. Food security is a major issue for the state of Western Australia. When we look at food security, it's broadly defined as when all people at all times have physical, social and economic access to a sufficient quantity of safe, healthy, nutritious food that meets the dietary needs and food preferences for an active and healthy life. When we talk about food security, it's important that we recognise that food security has 4 key dimensions. We talk about food availability, we talk about food access, we talk about food use, and finally we talk about food stability and sustainability. When we're talking about food availability, we're talking about the supply chain, the supply side of the equation. We're talking here about food production. We're talking about food transport and distribution, food storage and processing, and indeed the trade in food products, which, as we've previously discussed, WA is a major exporter of commodities, but yet 46% of the food within Western Australia is imported. Food access talks fundamentally about the capacity of consumers to actually purchase food. And the key dimension here is household incomes and food prices. Household incomes, of course, are contingent upon trends in the macroeconomic environment, such as interest rates, unemployment, and of course food prices. Well, these of course are impacted by supply, and it's the supply side of the equation that is the thing that is most volatile, as supply tends to be impacted and influenced of course by climatic changes, variability, and of course, as we've seen recently, by wars and some of the other issues that are occurring on a global basis. Food utilisation talks about how the consumer uses the food. This talks about the nutritional value of the food, how the food is cooked and prepared in the home, food hygiene and food sanitation, and the key dimension here, of course, is food safety. But we also need to consider the diversity of food in the diet, for man does not live on bread alone. And we need also to think about the cultural acceptability of food, that people from different nations bring with them their own consumption habits. And so whether we eat rice, potatoes or noodles is a dimension, of course, of this food use and food utilisation. Food stability and sustainability looks at these 3 dimensions: food availability, food access and food use over time. This effectively looks at the resilience then of the food system to climatic variability and to things like food stocks and food reserves. Important to recognise that today the average consumer probably only has between 3 to 5 days of food in terms of the reserves that they have within the pantry. And in part, that's largely the result of the supermarket's purchasing strategies, which use today a concept called just in time. So that basically means that it's up to suppliers to deliver the food to the warehouses and to the distribution centres at the time that it's required. We don't have a lot of stocks and reserves of food within the state of Western Australia. And so, as we saw a moment ago, when we do have, as a result of flooding on the Nullarbor, a breakdown in either the road or the rail system, the state is particularly vulnerable then to a food insecurity situation. We also need to appreciate that things like employment, household incomes, of course, are impacted by things like rising interest rates. And of course, as we've seen recently with the Reserve Bank changing and shifting interest rates, that's putting more and more pressure on household incomes. And so some households are having to make basic decisions about whether they're actually going to eat at all or whether they're going to pay rent and or other household expenses. So it's this change in income, it's these changes in the macroeconomic environment that do have a negative impact on food security within the state. We need therefore to appreciate that within the state of Western Australia, as much as 25 to 35% of the households within WA are food insecure. That effectively means that within these households, either parents and or children are not getting the food that they actually need. As I've indicated, low incomes and unemployment are some of the key factors that contribute to this, but there are other factors such as chronic illness, gambling, and or substance abuse. We also need to appreciate that too many people are making very poor food choices. Today, people are tending to eat more food that is energy dense, high in sugar, high in fat, high in salt, and has relatively low dietary fibre, minerals and vitamins. And that is having a significant negative impact in terms of health, as it impacts then, of course, upon things like cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes and a whole range of cancers. But it also affects and has a direct impact on mental impairment. So that particularly within the first 1,000 days, it's really, really important that young children have access to the correct types of food because it will impact their cognitive development. So we must appreciate that we are what we eat, and therefore diet has a significant impact on both our long-term health and mental well-being. It's widely publicised that as much as 1/3 of the food that is actually produced for consumption is never eaten. Within most of the developed countries, the majority of this food loss occurs not at the farm level, not at the food distribution level, not at the retail level, but it actually occurs at the household level. It is the decisions that consumers actually make on a daily basis which contributes to food waste and to food losses. Within a state of Western Australia, much of the food that is discarded is a result of poor appearance, aesthetics, but it's also because of things like best before and or use by dates, where again, if consumers don't understand or appreciate the difference, food that is perfectly good is otherwise lost and simply discarded. But we also see that it's also the impact of the retail sector itself, that we do see a lot of banded offers, for example, within the fresh fruit and vegetable industry, where you buy 2, get 1 free. So effectively, consumers then are tempted to purchase more food than they actually need, which then simply results in that food being discarded because it is not consumed.
Thanks, Peter. So there are issues that are facing us. The question is, do we need to do something about them? And if so, when and how? Is there an opportunity for a supported, coordinated change? So how do we find out what the stakeholders actually thought? So we needed to engage with the whole food supply chain in WA to have a chance to have their say. A big job? Yep. So how do we do it? We needed to engage with each of these sectors: input suppliers, producers, wholesalers and processors, and retailers. We worked through WA NRMs to their farming partners, peak industry bodies to their membership, industry associations to businesses, professional membership bodies to members, and then face-to-face through our contacts and networks. So Peter, can you tell us how the input questions were planned and used?
Okay, thank you, Graham. Well, as we've indicated a moment ago, information was sought from all of the stakeholders using a prepared questionnaire. We wanted to talk to input suppliers. This is an aspect of the supply chain that's often overlooked and ignored, but yet input suppliers have a key impact in terms of what farmers actually produce, and in turn then, of course, the quality or outcome of what producers do. We wanted, of course, to talk to food producers themselves, to the various wholesalers, the processors that are engaged within bringing us that food, and particularly here we needed to speak to organisations such as AIFST, the Australian Institute of Food Science and Technology, so that we could actually get to those people that were involved in the food manufacturing and food processing. But of course we also needed to talk to retailers, because retailers are that group that are closest to the consumers, and they can tell us what's actually going on, what it is that consumers are looking for, and what it is that consumers are prepared to pay for. What we used was a concept called PESTLE. It basically comes out of strategic management, but PESTLE is a technique that looks at the political, economic, social, technological, legal and environmental constraints. So using the PESTLE framework, what we wanted to know from the various stakeholders was what were the key constraints that were impacting on the business, what their industry associations were doing, what they themselves were doing, and what they believed then government needed to do to address the various constraints that they identified. This was a qualitative data collection exercise. So once we'd collected the data, what we wound up then doing was using through a dynamic master lists, the information was encoded, converting basically the qualitative to quantitative, and was then entered into the SBS program for analysis. And through that, we were basically able to report then the frequencies and the number of citations that industry gave to the various constraints and the various solutions that industry foresaw to the problems that it faced.
Thanks, Peter. So now we need to review the interim findings from the input provided by stakeholders. We plan to discuss two broad sectors: fruit and vegetable producers, their wholesale and retail streams, the meat and grain producers, their wholesale and retailer streams, and we'll kick off with the fruit and vegetable producers. So Peter, what did we find with stakeholders from the fresh produce part of our supply chain? Firstly producers, then retail partners.
Thank you, Graham. Well, let's deal firstly with the political constraints that are impacting the fresh fruit and vegetable industry. Perhaps with no surprise, the number one constraint was purely and simply that there's just too much red tape, too much bureaucracy, too many forms to fill in. What we've also observed from the industry was the rising cost of compliance. Compliance in terms of environment, controls and issues, compliance in terms of water, compliance in terms of issues like food safety and the increasing legislation, particularly under the Food Safety Act 2008, which puts the emphasis back then on producers. But of course, more recently, we've seen the imposition of additional policies and legislation in areas such as, for example, the Modern Slavery Act 2018. And of course, there's also the recent changes to occupational health and safety legislation. So it's getting harder and harder for producers to actually do the core part of their business. Constraints are just increasing. It's becoming more and more difficult for people to actually do their job. Important also to appreciate that at the time this study was conducted, just after COVID, labour was a key constraint in the industry. Producers simply couldn't get enough labour because, of course, at that time there were the bans on the backpackers and seasonal workers. That was having a significant negative impact then on terms of producers' capacity and ability to produce and indeed, in many instances, to harvest. There was also the lack of or perceived lack of investment, particularly in rural infrastructure. And we'll see this later when we talk particularly about the lack of broadband internet connection in rural areas, but it also relates to the declining state, particularly of rural roads and transportation infrastructure. There's also the inability to access water and the, again, legislation and issues associated with water licensing. Local government charges, the increasing in rents. But there was also a feeling from many of the producers that there was a lack of support to the sector and increasingly a lack of long-term planning for the sector. Fortuitously, however, the horticultural industry within Western Australia is well served by probably around 5 producer groups. We've got vegetables WA, potatoes WA, stone fruit, pome fruit, the table grape producers, citrus. There's a number of them. These associations are doing a lot of very positive work for their grower members in terms of policy advocacy, but also through organisations like Horticulture Innovation. There's an awful lot of research occurring, and certainly within the state of Western Australia we've had some very positive outcomes from those research programs, particularly with the release of apple varieties. And of course we've got a history within the state of bringing a number of new apple varieties to market. It's also about promoting industry best practice. Through workshops and field days, industry groups are brought together and producers are able to learn from one another about what technologies, what techniques and what things are actually working that can not only save them money, but also allow them to address some of the environmental issues, but also to improve the quality of the product. Industry associations were actively working with government to facilitate access to water, to new markets, and indeed to help and to assist with gaining the labour that the industry so desperately required. Industry is also in a very positive position to be able to offer advice to government, particularly around invasive species and the control and management of some of the new pests and diseases that have made their way into the state. In terms of government, what industry believe government needs to be doing, there's no doubt that support and the need for government to provide more support for local producers. The most interesting constraint that emerged from the producers was the need to curb and to control the growth and the amount of market power that is held by the supermarkets within the state. The impact of the supermarket dominance in the horticultural sector is significant and potentially negative in the long term. We've certainly seen how such legislation was introduced in the UK many years ago to curb the control of the supermarket and to ensure that rather than having just a duopoly, the market share was more equitably shared across a greater number of players. The concern here by the producers is that the dominance by the supermarkets is forcing prices down, and that's having a negative impact then of course upon the producer's capacity and ability to innovate, and that then in turn is having a significant negative impact in the long-term success of the industry. And we only need to look at, for example, the impact of the $1 a litre for milk and the impact that that had on the dairy industry to appreciate and to understand where the producers are coming from. There was also a desire from producers to see government spend a lot more money in terms of improving and enhancing rural infrastructure, particularly in terms of roads. The desire, as we've seen already, to improve and to enhance the legislation to make it easier for backpackers and seasonal workers to come into the state. But the need also for government to look at things more holistically. Government needed to consult more with industry before implementing policy, and of course to reduce the amount of red tape that was impacting and influencing the producers themselves. When we looked at the economic constraints, the key issue here was the increasing cost of inputs. Again, post-COVID, as a result perhaps in part of the conflict in Ukraine, we've started to see the costs of fuel increase, and of course the increased costs also of chemicals and fertiliser. The lack of labour was having a significant negative impact, both in terms of availability for both planting, both harvesting, but also in terms of quality. In parallel also, we've actually seen the low prices coming through the industry, again in part because of the increasing power of the supermarkets and their capacity to dominate and to dictate prices, and the increasing costs of compliance, again in part as a result of legislation, but also in part again of the needs for supermarkets to require suppliers to meet a whole range of new parameters, including, for example, the Modern Slavery Act, and again occupational health and safety changes. Consumer price resistance was obviously occurring because, again, household incomes, as we've seen, have been constrained, which impacts then consumers' propensity and ability to pay. The pressure from market intermediaries, the rising costs of government charges, and of course the increasing costs here associated with transportation and logistics. In order to be able to address those constraints, more and more of the producers within Western Australia were engaging in direct marketing. That is, they're tending to bypass the Perth wholesale markets and to engage directly with restaurants and other institutional food users. For smaller producers, their capacity and ability to engage in farmers' markets and farm gate sales, and for other producers to engage in e-commerce. This is meaning and resulting in more and more producers actually establishing and developing their own brands and looking at developing new market opportunities. To support these initiatives, particularly when producers implement and introduce their own brands, is the need to improve quality. And so producers were spending more and more time and more cost to try to improve and to enhance the quality of the products that they produced. We're also looking at producers trying to reduce costs themselves through the implementation of new technologies, through improved on-farm planning and indeed improved on-farm management techniques. But for some producers, it's all getting just too hard and too tough. And particularly for those producers where there is no son or daughter showing an interest in the family, the only logical thing for them to do is to exit the industry. And so we're seeing more and more producers choosing to actually exit the industry. And it's these sorts of pressures, particularly for smallholder producers as they leave the industry, that again undermines and potentially threatens some of the diversity of product and indeed the food security within the state. When we looked at the social constraints, the key issue that tended to emerge was no social licence. Social licence refers to the level of public trust that is granted to a corporate entity or to an industry sector by a society. This social licence generally refers to or talks about the belief that the activities that are being undertaken by that industry sector are consistent with society's expectations and beliefs. And so while most people might see food, and particularly fresh fruit and vegetables, as being and or having negative impacts on the environment, but very positive impacts on their health, there is always this concern, particularly towards the industry, in terms of things like chemical control and environmental impact, particularly towards bird species. So this is where things like social licence start to impact the industry. It's how the industry practices then impact on society's expectations and stakeholders' values. The key issue here, particularly around social licence, is that we get a lot of negative press from industry, but yet industry itself is not talking about or communicating the positive sides of the story, and that's the real key issue I think that emerges. We've talked also about the lack of labour. We've talked also about the inability of the industry to compete with particularly the mining sector. So this, again, is having significant long-term negative effects on the industry. What was perceived to be the outcome? Well, industry itself believed that from the point of view of government, there was a need to promote the industry to young people, to implement more traineeships, to provide a career pathway for young people entering the industry. And it's these three issues that are paramount in the long-term success of the fruit and vegetable industries within the state. Looking at the production constraints, the key issue within the state of Western Australia is the lack of technical support. Obviously, we've seen the diminishing amount of resources from the Department of Primary Industries and Rural Development. But what we're also seeing is, at a private level, the lack of support from the service and or technical industries. There's simply the lack of technicians, there's the lack of equipment, there's the lack of machinery that is having a significant negative impact on the capacity and ability of producers to access the technical support and the equipment and the machinery that they actually need. The fresh fruit and vegetable industry, on the other hand, are taking steps to address some of the issues around benchmarking, which was perceived by many of the producers to be an issue. When we looked at the environmental constraints, not unexpectedly, the key issue was climate variability. And particularly within the horticultural industry, climate variability has two key impacts in terms of both temperature, but also in terms of rainfall, and as we've talked earlier already about the distribution of that rainfall. Increasing temperature, particularly for stone fruit and other crops that have a winter chilling requirement, is having a significant negative impact in terms of yield and productivity. But what we're also seeing as a result of the lack of rainfall is the pressure and the need then for producers to use the water more efficiently. The lack of rainfall also is having an impact, of course, in terms of the forests. And with the lack of rainfall in the forest and the lack of flowering species particularly, that's bringing more and more of the bird species in to, of course, attack the orchards, and then the significant damage that's actually occurring at that level. We're also seeing, particularly within the industry, concerns about the recent or incoming bans around plastic packaging and the impact that that is going to have on the industry. Because at this point in time, there are no cost-effective alternatives. We're also seeing, not unexpectedly, with residential development, particularly in the north of the city and the south of the city, the significant loss of agricultural land to residential and commercial development. We're also seeing concerns, particularly around the use of chemicals and how, of course, we can then be more efficient and effective in reducing the impact of agricultural chemicals on the wider environment. So what were producers themselves then doing to address these chemical constraints? Well, needless to say, most producers now are looking at using water more efficiently. They're looking at reducing the use of hazardous chemicals. Most farmers now are members of one of the various techniques that are operated and or managed by industry that are seeking and enhancing to improve productivity without impacting negatively on the environment. We're seeing increasing adoption of sustainable farming practices and regenerative farming practices. We're seeing more and more farmers, for example, adopting IPM, integrated pest management techniques. For some farmers, they're actually choosing to relocate to areas that are more suitable for the crops that they want to grow. And other farmers are moving into protected cropping and net housing or netting to protect their crops from damage by particularly bird species, and giving them also, just more simply, a much greater control of the environmental conditions. So there's a lot of very positive things happening at a producer level to address the long-term environmental constraints within the industry.
Thanks, Peter. So from the fresh fruit and vegetable producer's perspective, we found the following: too much red tape, rising cost of compliance, climate variability, lack and cost of labour and inputs, increasing power of the supermarkets, lack of technical support, lack of career pathways, and poor industry perception as the key issues for them to deal with. In looking at what their peak industry bodies are doing, it's largely in the areas of policy advocacy, research, plant breeding programs or research programs, promoting best practice, and in a couple of instances people said nothing. What are the businesses doing? minimising and reducing their waste, using innovative technologies, improving management, extending product range, using multiple suppliers, focus on quality versus quantity, differentiating themselves in the marketplace, and as a result of that, some direct marketing. So the perspective of the industry where they needed support from government was that local producers needed greater recognition. There needed to be a review of competition policy, and with that, the curbing or the control of supermarket power, the distorting of the market, the red tape reduction, so the difficulties of achieving outcomes through meeting government and legislative requirements, the issues with backpackers and seasonal workers, infrastructure maintenance, incentives for sustainable production, and consumer education. So Peter, what commentary did our fruit and vegetable retailers provide?
Thank you, Graham. The perspective from the retailers was interesting. However, before I talk about the retailers' perspective, I think it's important for us to understand who it was that we spoke to. Needless to say, unfortunately, we were not able to get responses from the major supermarkets. However, we did talk to a lot of the independent IGA stores across the Perth metropolitan region, and of course we spoke to a lot of the independent retailers operating within the major shopping centres and of course within the suburban shopping centres. Not unexpectedly, from the small retailers' perspective, the main concern that they had was the lack of any long-term planning by both government at a state level, but government also at a local government level. We need to appreciate and to understand that the population of Perth is growing, but it's growing at a relatively slow rate. But it seems that the amount of supermarkets that are being built is expanding much rapidly, or more rapidly than the population. And that is having a significant negative impact then on the competition between the retailers themselves, but also then the impact that the supermarkets then are having upon the small independent retailers. It's this lack of competition policy that is having the significant and negative impact on small retailers that is really the major concern driving the issues within the sector. Some spoke about the fact that over time, much of the product testing that's been occurring on retail shelves is no longer happening, and this is reducing then consumer confidence in the product. There's also the deregulation of shopping hours, which again is making it more and more difficult for the small independents to compete with the major supermarket chains. The lack of labour, and of course, not unexpectedly, the high levels of government debt and particularly the constraints that we face that are then impacting government's decisions to face and to place their emphasis in other aspects of the economy. Other retailers spoke about the inconsistent quarantine regulations, particularly as that impacted and influenced their capacity and ability to import products. From the retailer's perspective, the critical role that they foresaw for government was to curb and to control the growth of supermarkets within the state of Western Australia. What they sought and required was a review of competition policy and a regulation of online sales. Many of the retailers perceive that a lot of the online retailers today are not operating through ABNs, and so of course they don't have the same tax implications for those businesses that are operating legitimately. As we've seen and discussed a number of times already, there is the need for more backpackers and seasonal workers. Even at the retailer's perspective, they were cognizant of the constraints that the food producers were facing at the farm level, and indeed the negative impact on quality that the lack of labour was actually having. What they wanted to see was improved town planning, a reduction then in retail competition, and a reduction also then on urban encroachment, particularly into the more productive horticultural regions that surround the Perth peri-urban district. What the retailers wanted to see from government was a clear strategy and a clear policy for the food industry. And looking at the economic constraints, and again, remember that we're coming here out of post-COVID, the key issue that retailers were experiencing was the lack of product, and associated with the lack of product, the high wholesale prices. High wholesale prices were having a significant negative impact then upon the capacity and ability of retailers to actually pass those costs on to consumers. Retail margins were having to be cut because, again, with consumers being income constrained and low levels of employment, again as a result of COVID at that time, households simply did not have the amount of money to be able to purchase fresh fruit and vegetables. And so as a result of that, when you're talking $8 a cauliflower, for example, retailers were selling at $8 a cauliflower. They were not making any money at all. And any money that they did make was actually by cutting the cauliflower in half and perhaps buying or selling half a cauliflower for $4.50. So their margins were being quite literally gutted. And that was having significant negative impacts then upon the long-term profitability of the industry. In parallel, interest rates were increasing, wages were increasing. It was just simply getting too expensive and just too costly to actually operate their businesses. The economic constraints and what retailers were actually doing to address those economic constraints, well, the best way to describe it, they were doing everything that they possibly could to stay afloat. This meant looking at, for example, reducing wastage, rotating the product on the shelf often, pre-cutting product that wasn't selling, banding it up and selling it at a cheap or basically cost price to simply remove it. Others were looking at purchasing on a daily basis from the market, again to reduce the amount of stock that they had and thereby reduce the amount of wastage. Others were using multiple suppliers, and as we saw before from the producer's perspective, with more and more producers wanting to engage directly with the retailers were able to take advantage of this trend. But what we've also seen at the retail sector is the increasing diversification within the retail sector. Retailers were finding that on fresh fruit and vegetables alone, it was becoming more and more difficult for them to make a profit. And so they were choosing to differentiate and to diversify, producing a whole range then of products such as dairy, fresh meat, other processed meat categories, fruit juices, and other products to simply supplement and improve the range of products that they were actually selling. Within the state of Western Australia, given that a lot of the retailers are actually of Asian origin, we're seeing a lot of the retail stores actually become sort of specialty Asian shops, providing a whole range of fresh and frozen condiments, noodles, and other condiments to actually go with and to supplement the choice and the range of food choices. So there's a lot of pressure and a lot of competition in the retail sector. In terms of consumer trends, and this is interesting because as we indicated before, it's the retailers who are closest to the consumers and are therefore the best able to advise us about what's actually happening within the industry. What consumers want to know is where their product is from. And post-COVID, there has been a significant shift in consumer preference towards local produce, which is perceived to be fresher, to be more nutritious, and indeed, post-COVID, for consumers to show a much greater interest in smallholder producers, this movement away from major international producers, almost a anti-globalization sentiment. Producers, or consumers rather, want to support local producers. For them, it's a way and a means of enhancing and improving food security. Needless to say, with more and more people working today, particularly couples, there's a demand for much greater convenience food. And so we're seeing more pre-cut and more pre-packaged products. More things like salad mixes, soup mixes, and stir-fry mixes. There's also an increasing demand at the consumer level for seasonal product. People want to eat the product when it's in season because that's when it tastes best. And it's also when it's cheapest. Needless to say, and not unexpectedly, consumers wanted to know why prices were so high. Because as we've already talked about before, consumers are facing more and more economic price pressures, and again, that basic decision about whether they're going to heat and or to be able to pay their bills and or their rent. The thing that is most scary from a perspective where indeed organisations like Perth NRM and others are actively supporting and encouraging more sustainable farming practices is the fact and the recognition from the retail sector that there is little to no demand for sustainable product. Consumers are not prepared to pay for sustainable products in the current environment. And that's potentially then having a negative impact then on the choices that producers themselves are actually making to be more sustainable. So what is it that retailers are doing then to address some of these trends and to some of these issues? Well, from the independent retailer's perspective, the thing that they can do better than, of course, the major supermarket chains is to educate consumers. They're providing the advice to consumers about where the product is from, when the product's in store, how to use it, and indeed how to store the product. They're promoting local product far more aggressively. They're also communicating with their buyers far more often to get that feedback from producers about what's available, when it's available, and indeed trying to improve and to enhance the level of service that they provide to consumers. They're also developing a greater online presence themselves. More and more of independent retailers have recognised that through using things like social media, they're actually able to communicate with their consumers, to tell them when the product is in season, and particularly for those consumers who are still processing their own product at home, to let them know when it's most plentiful and therefore when it's most cheap. But what they can also do through social media is to advise consumers about when the product's not up to standard, that there are quality constraints as a result of hailstorms or other climatic events. And thus, by communicating with consumers, they're able to build better relationships with consumers. That can also improve and enhance the capacity then and ability of the consumers to offer a whole range now of other valuated services, such as, for example, home delivery and indeed the click and collect type policies, where consumers now can talk directly to the retailers about what they want, and retailers can package that up so that on the way home consumers can just simply pick up and collect the box of goodies, or indeed in some retailers they were actually delivering to the consumer's place of residence. So again, it's quite dynamic and a lot of very positive things happening at a consumer level, at a retail level, to match or to better match the trends that the consumers are looking for.
Thanks for that, Peter. So from the fresh produce retailer's perspective, we found the following. Constraints were a lack of product and supply, lack of labour, increasing prices, poor and declining quality, which we'd have to say were probably indicative of the times we've just been through, but also showed the fragility of our supply chains in this space. We also saw discussion about inconsistent quarantine regulations for product that's being imported nationally or internationally. And then the biggies were no long-term planning and poor town planning / in relation to retail competition. What the businesses are doing, we were told, is minimising and reducing waste, extending their product ranges, using multiple suppliers to give themselves variability and price points, focus on quality rather than quantity to keep their consumers or customers engaged, purchasing daily, often to meet those changing requirements, differentiating themselves in the market, and in a lot of cases they're actually pre-ordering product to be assured of supply. What we saw from the retailers in need from government was the control or the curbing of control of the power of the supermarkets, and how that's distorting the supply chain and certainly consumer benefit. The need for those labour requirements, more support for local producers and small retailers, the importance of educating consumers, and that review of competition policy. In terms of consumer trends, what came through was consumers wanting to know the origin of their products, that they were demanding local supply, their need for or desire for more convenience, so ready prepared foods and home replacement meals. They're also concerned about prices being so high, and again we look at how these supply and demand distortions we've had in recent times have affected the availability and price of product, but also the markups that product achieves as it travels through the supply chain by intermediaries taking their clip of the ticket. There's also, it is apparent that there's little demand for sustainable produce at this stage. So Peter, what did we find from stakeholders from the meat and grain part of the supply chain? Firstly, let's talk about producers and then their retail partners.
Before we start, I think it's important again to understand who our respondents were for this group of farmers. It's important to recognise within the state of Western Australia the great diversity of agricultural enterprises, from the mixed cropping operations perhaps in the southwest of the state to the pastoralists and graziers in the north of the state and perhaps in the central regions of the state. Because we will see as we go through this presentation that there are some marked differences in terms of much of the responses here, depending upon whether producers were indeed coming from the northern and central regions as pastoralists and graziers, as opposed to those in the southwest of the state and the grain belt region who were operating mixed farming enterprises. So it is important, as I've suggested, that we bear in mind that I'm not separating or aggregating the responses. The two groups are all mixed in here as one. In this respect, we tend to find that amongst the responses that we had, that most of the producers were involved in some way or another with livestock production, although some of the respondents here are involved in mixed farming enterprises. The most significant constraint at the farm level was again too much red tape, the bureaucracy. And for the pastoralists and graziers in particular who are leasing stations, there were a number of issues associated with their arrangements with government. It was simply taking too long to renew leases. Government was restricting or imposing things upon what they could and couldn't do, particularly in relation to implementing more sustainable solutions. And of course, not unexpectedly, again for the pastoralists and graziers, issues associated with native title. More generically, across the agricultural industry, was a perception that government, it seems, simply does not understand the industry. Government is too remote, government is too detached, and in parallel, government support for the sector is diminishing. The industry perceived that there were no long-term plans for the government, for the industry. Decisions were being made on the run, and many producers spoke about and hinted at the export bans that, of course, were imposed, albeit almost a decade ago or over a decade ago, following, of course, the issues around animal welfare in Indonesia. Market access continued to be a problem for many producers, and of course government support here was required to be able to overcome some of these issues. But at an industry level, many producers themselves also spoke about the fact that the industry bodies themselves are not unified. They're not speaking with one voice, and that's making it more and more difficult then for industry to have then any significant impact at a government or political level. Nevertheless, industry is doing some very positive things. Of course, through the research organisations, GRDC and the Meat and Livestock Organisation, significant research is being undertaken both to address issues of productivity at the farm level, but also to undertake consumer research in both domestic and in international markets. Through industry associations, there was a great deal of political lobby and political advocacy with regard to issues like market access, to the supply chain constraints that farmers were experiencing, and of course a great deal of support to address issues such as native title. There was also, of course, through the various organisations, the various farmer groups, the farm improvement groups and farmer associations, the transfer of information through field days and workshops to address many of the new issues, constraints and legislation that are making their way into the farming sector. Industry perceived, needless to say, that government needed to reduce the amount of red tape. There was a perception by the farmers that government needed to trust land management and farmers. Farmers are, on the whole, doing the right thing in terms of environment, but also in terms of issues like animal welfare. There's a desire and or a demand from the industry for government to actually collaborate with industry, talk to them, communicate with them, engage with them. There's also the requirement not only within the fresh produce industry, but also within agriculture more generically, for backpackers and seasonal workers, particularly around harvest time and also, of course, with seeding vacation. Of course, we also need to appreciate that there's the need for government to address the issues around carbon farming and carbon credits, particularly again for those farmers that are operating in the more remote areas, because for them, carbon farming and carbon credits is becoming a second income stream that is providing them with levels of income that are important, particularly during the drought years. And looking at the economic constraints, the key issue that was perceived by the industry was the lack of labour. There was also the increasing costs of inputs and the low prices at a farm level that were having a negative impact on what we describe as the cost-price squeeze. It's getting more and more difficult for small farmers and farming operations to actually make money. Input prices are increasing while output prices are decreasing. At the time that the study was conducted, remember too that WA was just coming out of a drought. At that point in time, the quality of the livestock was generally poor because of the result of the lack of feed, the high cost then of replacing stock, and the high cost of transport associated then with moving that stock to the abattoirs, and indeed then for farmers who were actually engaging with their own slaughter of getting the product to market. For the meat industry in particular, there was a perceived lack of domestic meat processing facilities, the lack of competition within the sector, and hence the capacity and ability, particularly of abattoirs then, to be able to have a stronger market position and therefore to have a greater impact then on the profitability of farming operations. Most farmers, needless to say, were experiencing some financial difficulty. They were having difficulty in accessing loans, and of course with the lack of funding, the inability then to invest in farm equipment, in farm machinery, and indeed to undertake some of the necessary on-farm activities to improve and to enhance the sustainability of their farming operations. The top actions that farmers were actually undertaking to address these constraints were fundamentally by investing in technology and research and development. Farmers were seeking to both increase productivity, but also to improve quality. Farmers were seeking to diversify and to broaden their income base, seeking to improve, as I saw a moment ago, the resilience of their business through, for example, the introduction of carbon farming and carbon credits. Other farmers were simply rethinking their business models, and others introducing more improved on-farm management practices. What government needs to do to address these economic constraints, farmers foresaw, as I've already indicated, the need for government to move quickly on the legislation towards farming, carbon farming and carbon credits. Farmers needed clarity and farmers needed confidence. Farmers also saw a role for government in providing drought assistance and for training and the education of the agricultural workforce, again, particularly following the recent introduction of the new occupational health and safety legislation. In dealing with consumers and society in general, there was a perception by the agricultural industry, the perception that consumers have very little knowledge of the agricultural sector. On the whole, there's a very negative view of agriculture and of the bad sector, the influence and the impact that actually comes from the industry. This misinformation, in fact, is being perpetuated through social media and again the activity of some of the animal activists who simply do not understand and appreciate what actions farmers are actually taking. This was leading then to this significant disconnect between the agricultural industry and the consumers with which they seek to serve. What was effectively happening here was that farmers are seeking to re-engage with their consumers. And to do that, more and more farmers today are actually looking towards on-farm processing. And we've seen this, of course, in terms of things like dairy and on-farm slaughterhouses or operations where farmers may be providing their stock to slaughterhouses but are retaining ownership of the stock to be able then to market that product in the market and in a differentiated manner so that they can receive much higher prices from retailers and indeed institutional food users. We're also seeing more and more producers seeking to target niche markets with their own branded product through direct marketing techniques and of course through social media websites and social media itself through Facebook pages and other mechanisms. So farmers themselves now are trying to reconnect directly with the consumers. What government was perceived to do, or what government needed to do, was to increase the visibility of the industry. Producers saw a need for agriculture to be added to the school curriculum. Kids need to understand where their food is coming from and how their food is being produced, and indeed to promote agriculture as a career choice. Farmers wanted to be more transparent. Farmers want to promote the positive aspects of the industry. Farmers are doing a whole range of very positive impacts on things like biodiversity and environmental issues around things like sustainability. Farmers do recognise their role as the custodians and stewards of the land. And indeed, most farmers have an expectation or a desire to pass that on to future generations in a better condition than what they themselves took over the farm. So it's these personal values by farmers that are driving these pushes into more sustainable farming practices, but are not being adequately communicated then to the consumers and indeed to society at large. And we can say the same thing about issues around animal welfare. Farmers acknowledge that the quality of the meat depends upon the way in which the animals have been treated, and farmers do not, of an inherent nature, mishandle their livestock. They acknowledge the importance of good animal husbandry, but yet, as we've seen before, the actions and activities of animal activists can seriously undermine the positive impacts of the farming community. The issue that we really face with are two issues. There are internal constraints and external constraints. Internal, there was a perception by members of the farming community that farmers actually lack self-belief. What we're also seeing, and we're also very, very conscious of, is the declining levels of mental health within the farming community and, of course, the suicide levels that are reaching epidemic proportions. That's not good, and that's not positive, and we need to do something to obviously address these issues. It's tough, and our farmers need more support. Externally, the principal issue again was the lack of any social licence. Social licence refers to the level of public trust that is granted to a corporate entity or to an industry sector by a society, where society believes that the activity of that industry is consistent with society's expectations and values. And this is earned through industry engagement with that society, where operating practices and stakeholder values are transmitted and communicated to an industry. In other words, what the agricultural industry needs to do is to tell its side of the story, and to tell it much more aggressively and much more positively. We need to better communicate with society and with our downstream consumers. We must acknowledge that within rural society, populations are declining. Farms are getting larger, and more people are leaving rural areas to reside in the cities. And that's impacting both the availability of labour and the quality of labour. And then for that labour that is available, there's the increasing competition with the mining sector. As we've also seen socially, the increasing occupational health and safety legislation, which has recently made its way into the industry, now means that potentially, and farm incidents and farm accidents do occur, unfortunately, too often, but with the legislation now making it possible for farmers to be charged for manslaughter, there's a necessity now for farmers to actually train their workers. But training the workers comes with a cost. And again, as we've seen before with the farming sector, the cost-price squeeze. Output prices are falling while input costs are increasing. The farms are financially constrained. That's just putting more and more pressure on the operation of our farming community. So what does our industry sector need to do? Well, there's a number of issues here that we need to do to try to address these social impediments. We need an ethical, on-farm, quality assurance system. We need to look at greater farm viability, because when farms are more viable, then they have the capacity and ability to attract workers and provide that long-term economic employment opportunity. Others spoke about the opportunity and the need for aggregation and concentration within the tertiary education sector. And having come from this sector, I know over the 30 years that I was at Curtin, on more than one occasion, we attempted to consolidate agricultural training within the university sector. We need to promote the industry to young people. We need to improve the educational and health services in the rural community so that we can actually make living in rural areas more attractive. And we need to educate the animal liberationists. We need to tell our side of the story and to be much more assertive in getting our message across to the community. In looking at the technological constraints, I think most of these are probably self-evident, and particularly within rural areas of Western Australia, the lack of any broadband connectivity is having a significant negative impact on the introduction of smart farming technologies. Without internet connectivity, most of these smart farming technologies are simply going to fall in a heap. They are useless without access to the internet. But there are numerous other issues involved around things like pest control, around addressing micronutrient deficiencies and toxicities, around the control of birds, and around the control particularly of wild animals, in particular wild dogs. The consumer's non-acceptance of GM technology is seen to be disappointing. In fact, it was in 2015 that the then Chief Executive Officer of Cargill, the world's largest grain trader, foresaw and indicated that GM technologies would be instrumental in agriculture becoming more sustainable. And yet we have still a perception by so many of our consumers that GM food is Frankenstein food. There really is a need to change consumer perceptions. Despite these many constraints, farmers themselves are very, very adaptable. Where it's profitable to do so, farmers are implementing new technologies. And these include a whole range of things like solar water pumps, variable rate technologies, precision farming, precision ear tags or electronic ear tags that allow farmers to monitor where their stock is going and thus to be able to control better grazing and through rotational grazing to prevent the damage to pasture. Improved genetics, improved bloodlines, particularly again in adapting to climate change. The use of supplementary feeds and fodder supplements to again provide alternative feed sources for the livestock. And of course benchmarking techniques so that farmers have the capacity and ability to actually compare what they're doing and therefore to learn from one another. The role of government here in addressing these many constraints are obvious. The need to improve internet and broadband connectivity within the bush. The need to improve rural infrastructure and in particular the condition of rural roads. But also, as we've talked earlier, to pass the legislation on carbon farming and carbon credits and to do so quickly to provide the assurance and the confidence to the farming industry that this will provide, again, another income stream that will be viable for their businesses. The legal constraints are significant. As I indicated earlier, the recent occupational health and safety legislation now means that should an accident occur on farm, the farm manager may be charged with manslaughter. And that was seeing significant increases in costs in training new employees and indeed in attracting new employees. There are also concerns amongst the rural community about the upcoming and potential export bans on live cattle and sheep, compliance around things again like modern slavery legislation, native title, and of course the ongoing and constant competition from mining that threatens to undermine the long-term success of agriculture and grazing. What producers wanted to see was much greater and much tighter laws around trespass, particularly towards animal activists. For the concern here is not so much about transparency, but more about the threat to biosecurity, that the high incidence or the high possibility or likelihood that as these people snuck onto the farm to report about what farmers were doing, that they would potentially introduce a whole range of new diseases. At an environmental level, the key constraints here relate fundamentally to climate variability and to the lack of rainfall and to the lack of feed. That of course then brings competition from wild animals into the picture, and the need again for society to appreciate and to understand that when farmers do indeed take some environmental steps to control, for example, wild livestock, that taking such action is much better than allowing kangaroos and other native livestock or native animals to actually die of starvation. There's things like bushfires, land degradation, particularly occurring from overgrazing and erosion through salinity, and of course the ongoing pressure from wild dogs. What farmers were seeking to do here at an individual level was to improve on-farm decision-making at an operational level. Farmers today are taking more and more steps to ameliorate their soils, to fence off degraded areas, to improve and to enhance biodiversity, to look at no-till farming practices, to control and to manage their stocking rates, to install fire breaks, and where absolutely necessary, to cull wild animals and to cull wild dogs. At a government level, industry wanted to see better weather forecasting, which would facilitate and assist better decision-making on farm. Farmers wanted access to more information. And again, they wanted more clarity and transparency in supporting carbon farming practices on farm.
Thanks for that, Peter. So from the meat and grain producers' perspective, we found the following. Again, too much red tape, diminishing support from government, the increased costs of inputs and the lack of labour and its costs, farmers' lack of self-belief, lack of internet or poor telecoms, inability to cultivate alternative crops in the rangelands particularly, climate variability, lack of rainfall and water. What the peak industry bodies are doing for the meat and grain producers, undertaking research, policy advocacy and facilitating market access. What the businesses themselves are doing, technology innovation and R&D, quality control, quantity of production, diversifying, more on-farm processing, developing own brand with targeted marketing, implementing VRT and precision farming, using rotational grazing, improved on-farm decision making, and maintaining personal relationships. What meat and grain producers saw was needed from government was the need to reduce red tape that was constraining their capacity to develop. There needed to be greater trust with land managers, establish systems to measure and report carbon sequestration, dealing with the high cost and poor resolution of satellite imagery, improving health and education in rural and remote areas, adding agriculture to school curriculums in a more structured way, the education of consumers and of animal liberationists. So Peter, what commentary did the meat retailers provide us?
As we indicated from the outset with this segment of the research, we were fundamentally talking to retailers. The retailers here again are the small independent retailers that are existing within the major shopping centres, within the independent supermarkets, and those who are operating in the suburban shopping centres. Again, regrettably, we were unable to get any responses from the major supermarket chains. So we must understand and appreciate who it is that we're actually talking to. We were also able only to talk to meat retailers. While attempts were made to talk to a number of bakeries, the responses from the bakery sector, unfortunately, were negative. Bakeries just simply did not have the time to talk and to communicate with us. But there's also the aspect that within the bakery sector, and again, acknowledging now that we're talking about a transformed product, again, consumers don't eat wheat, consumers eat bread, that the product has been obviously transformed through a milling process and then a baking process. We must also acknowledge that within the baking industry, we do have a number of franchises. And again, numerous attempts were made to talk to those franchises. So for this section, we can really only talk about the meat retailers, but I'm sure that you'll find some of the findings here to be most valuable and, again, indicative of what's happening in the industry. For the butchers, there were two key political issues that were impacting the sector. The first of these was the recent legislation to ban single-use plastic bags, because at present, for the meat industry, there is no suitable alternative. And that's really concerning them in terms of how are they then going to present to consumers the fresh meat. The other issue that was emerging from retail butchers was the lack of clarity around definitions for terms like free range and or pasture fed. Retailers were clearly concerned about the potential involvement of the Fair Trade Commission and or the ACCC around them making claims that they could not necessarily support. For again, most retailers appreciate and acknowledge that even where livestock may be coming from, for example, the north of the state, it will often go on to a feedlot before it's then subsequently slaughtered. And it's this time during the feedlot that makes it then difficult for this livestock to be basically described as free range or pasture fed, when clearly it's not. So this was a real issue that the retail butchers needed to resolve. What they foresaw at a government level, however, went well beyond these issues. Retailers were seeking government support on a whole range of issues associated with, in particular, government grants for small businesses. Many of these retail butchers had indicated that during the COVID period they had been unable to qualify for many of the small business grants. And as a result of that, many of these businesses were in significant financial stress. What most of the small retailers spoke about was the need to review competition policy. They were concerned about the rising power of the supermarkets and the dominance that the supermarkets had within the sector, and hence the capacity and ability for them to, in the first instance, be able to differentiate their product, but also to be able to make adequate margins to remain viable. But within the meat sector, it was not just the power of the supermarkets that was of concern, it was also the apparent perception of the lack of any competition at the meat abattoir and wholesale sector. There were even suggestions of collusion, because when meat retailers had attempted to compare the prices, particularly for red meat and beef, between the various wholesalers, effectively they were finding that the prices were the same. There was no price difference between the wholesalers. But what they were also experiencing were costs associated with delivery. And these delivery charges were being imposed then by one wholesaler, would then suddenly be imposed by all the others. And that was making it then more and more difficult to be able to purchase the quantities of meat that they actually required. Because again, many of these retailers have limited storage capacity. So they want deliveries multiple times per week rather than simply just one time per meet. The other perception and constraint exercised by a number of the retailers was then the pressure by a lot of the wholesalers themselves to actually enter the retail market, where they were potentially then able to undercut the retailers and again capture then a share of the market that the retailers would have otherwise secured. There was a need to educate consumers around the nutritional value, particularly of red meat. There's a lot of negative pressure again coming through from environmentalists about the environmental impact that red meat is having on climate change, particularly in relation to things like methane. But yet red meat is so critically important to cognitive development, particularly in that 1,000-day or the first 5 years of a child's life. So producers and retailers foresaw a need for government to actually communicate the positive aspects of red meat consumption to the industry. Needless to say, in parallel, there was the need to sanction and control the activities of animal activists, which are having a negative impact again on industry perceptions and consumers' perceptions of the industry. At the retail meat industry sector level, labour was a key constraint, a major issue. They were seriously struggling to get enough labour, particularly in terms of the form of apprenticeships. So what producers were looking for was more support then from government in terms of apprenticeships and financial incentives for them to in fact engage apprentices. At a retail level, the key constraint at that time, and remember we did most of the interviews post-COVID, was the lack of supply. Two issues, of course, here that brought this about. The lack of product at the farm level, because again, remember, we were coming out of the drought. But also the lack of supply from the wholesalers themselves because of the inability to actually kill the livestock. The lack of labour within the abattoirs. And so what that was doing then was resulting in two issues. Costs were decreasing at the farm level because there was less demand from the abattoirs because they didn't have the staff to kill the livestock. But at the other end, prices were increasing because of the increasing demand coming through from the retail sector, but yet consumers' pay packets were falling, and so they were unable then to pay the prices. And so that was putting pressure then on the retail margins. Butchers were having to actually reduce their wholesale margins to be actually able to sell product and therefore for them to actually remain profitable. At the same time, many were reporting a reduction in retail and traffic, consumer traffic, More and more consumers, again post-COVID, were purchasing product online. And once the constraints had been addressed, as you may recall during COVID, many of the supermarkets implemented quantity constraints. You could only buy one pack of product or a certain quantity of product. Once the supply was resumed, consumers went back to the supermarkets, and again that was having a significant negative impact then on the amount of business that the small independent stores were doing. The other significant impact that we've talked about already and that is coming through the industry generically is this cost price squeeze situation. While they're having to reduce their retail margins because consumers don't have the cash to be able to actually pay for the product, at the same time the cost of rents is increasing, the cost of utilities increasing, the cost of labour is increasing, and the cost of labour is the major constraint at the retail level. So as you can start to appreciate at this point in time, our retail butchers are under significant economic duress, and that is having or will have significant long-term consequences for the industry if not addressed. In order to differentiate themselves from the major supermarkets, most of the independent butchers were focusing on quality. What the independent retailers were able to do that the supermarkets cannot is to provide the advice to consumers about what cuts of meat are best for the way that the consumer intends to actually use the product. But more and more independent retailers were also looking at how they could value add, how they could improve the service that they offered to the consumers by offering more pre-cooked meat, more marinated meat, and more convenient meat products like, for example, satays. More and more of the retail butchers were dealing with farmers directly, and as we saw a moment ago, of course, in parallel, more and more of the producers were actually seeking to develop their own brands and their own products. So in parallel, we're seeing this trend with more farm direct products coming from the farm then to the retail store. And that was enabling them to offer differentiated products. It also enabled them to offer a greater range of products. When we discussed food utilisation, one of the key issues that emerges at the retail butchery level is, of course, the need for meat to be halal, to satisfy, of course, the requirements, particularly of the Indonesian and Malaysian consumers, and of course those from the Middle Eastern origin. And so we are clearly seeing then a lot of differentiation at the meat retail level in terms of halal butcheries. Unfortunately, with the lack of labour, more and more of the retailers were simply having to work longer hours. And in order to minimise waste, as many of the retailers talked about waste management being fundamental to their bottom line, more of the butchers were actually engaging then in value-added and again convenient products in the form of things like sausages and or meat pies, which gave them the opportunity to utilise product that would otherwise be discarded because they had no use for it. In terms of the consumer trends, again, these are really interesting as they impact the industry. Consumers today are becoming more conscious. They want to know where their products is from. They want to know how it's been produced. And animal welfare, no surprise, is becoming more prominent. Consumers wanted to know why the price was so high. And of course, as we see here, there were two factors driving that. The reduction in the supply of livestock as a result of the drought, but also the cost associated with the culling of the meat at the abattoir level. But what we were also seeing, and what is of concern again for producers, is that there is little or no demand at the retail level for sustainably produced meat. It's simply perceived to be too expensive, and retailers are unable to pass those costs on to consumers. We've also seen consumers becoming more concerned about nutrition and health, and so we must acknowledge that within the meat sector, consumers today are eating less meat. And some of the retail butchers were actually starting to offer non-meat or plant-based meat substitutes, which is an interesting trend. But we must acknowledge that the cost of particularly red meat is becoming just prohibitive for so many consumers today. So while there is this issue around their capacity and ability to afford the product, there is also this underlying driver around nutrition and health, which is seeing people eating less meat, or red meat in particular, but also eating higher quality red meat. So what was happening at the retail level was the response by then the retailers to educate their consumers. And as I indicated a moment ago, it's about being able to tell consumers about how to use the product, what cuts of meat are going to be better suited to the way in which the consumer intended to use it. It was also about providing and aging meat, for example, particularly around steaks, but also providing more and more convenient products, satays, pies, sausage rolls, other processed meat products, and in some instances even providing pre-cooked meals for consumers. Convenience is the key driver today. Consumers are really finding that they are time constrained.
Thanks for that, Peter. Yes, very interesting. So, in summary, the constraints from the meat retailers were their concerns about the banning of single-use plastics in relation to meat product, also the labelling in terms of free range and grass-fed, that there needed to be some clarity in that space, the updated Food Act and its requirements, the constant threat of lockdowns, as we've indicated during that period that we've been through, the lack of product supply, the lack of labour, and the increasing cost of meat, beef and lamb in particular. What the businesses are doing, the meat retailers, focusing on quality, reducing price margins to remain in contact with their consumers, extend product range, so hanging and aging of meat, differentiating their product in the marketplace by varying product ranges and styles, educating consumers, which they can do very easily one-on-one, targeted marketing, and preparing and selling more pre-cooked meals. What the meat retailers saw government could do was provide more support for producers, local producers, more support for small business, that review of competition policy that's come through at all levels, and the importance of the education of consumers. The consumer trends that were seen through the meat retailers, consumers want to know the product origin, where it's come from. They're more quality conscious. In certain instances, they're eating less meat, and certainly a trend that we need to be conscious of. They want to know how to use each of these products, which the retailers could provide some advice on, and wanted to know why prices were so high. So responding to those pressures that are in the market. Okay, Peter, now let's introduce a couple of our industry participants and see what they have said after reading the interim report in answer to the questions we posed. We asked them, does the report adequately reflect the key issues that are affecting your industry? Secondly, are there any gaps that we need to identify and perhaps include? We then asked them what were the most critical issues for their industry, and then what government working with industry have the greatest opportunity for impact to improve food security in WA. So our first participant are Nick and Lucy Kelly from Newdigate, and they're going to talk to us about their business and the measures that they are undertaking to deal with the pressures that they're finding in the supply chain. So welcome to you both. Can you give us a bit of an idea of your business, please?
Sure. We've been working at perennial pasture cropping for a number of years now, and that's a system where rather than wait for perennial pastures to turn up on our property. We've been actively planting them. So I'm talking mainly about the summer active subtropical C4 perennials. And we are regenerative growers. We've since become organic certified as well. We didn't set out to be that way. That we ended up there almost by default, and it was a business decision to become certified. But my suspicion had been that the tools we used to my father cleared our farm from virgin bush, and it was mostly mallee scrub. But my suspicion has always been that the tools we used to get from virgin bush to a totally different system of growing pastures and crops and livestock is one that perhaps once we get to that new system, perhaps we can move on to new tools and do away with those tools such as chemical fertilizers and pesticides, and move to tools such as plants and animals and the other soil care principles. So that's kind of the foundation of our farming enterprise, and we're very much into stacking enterprises. So those things that complement the system from a soil health perspective. And we've had sheep on and off over the years. We've been in and out of cattle a little bit, but at the moment our focus has been the laying hens. We've got around 3,000 hens, and we're sending pallets of eggs mostly into Perth weekly. So that just gives you a little bit of an idea about our operation at the moment.
So that sounds like you've got right into this diversification of your business and looking at those base elements in terms of soil and soil integration with your production systems, and the diversity in your production activities is giving you a better business space to work from, I would expect. But would it be true to say that you're still measuring those sorts of things as you go?
Yeah, certainly, and we're far from where I ultimately want to be. I think implementing those tools and having what we understand as real soil health is quite a journey in our part of the world, given that we've got quite sandy, gravelly soil types. So to build organic matter, to build carbon, and to get soil really functioning from a biological perspective is quite a challenge. But that's what we're really interested in, and that certainly led us to this place of having a really diversified enterprise.
Yeah, sound business thinking for sure. So from the point of view of the interim report into food security in WA, did you feel that the key issues that are impacting the grains and livestock industry were captured from what you know of what others are experiencing?
I think most of the main issues were certainly touched on. Some of the comments made, didn't quite resonate with me and my understanding and my thinking of systems. But from a food security perspective, I think so. I think it was pretty comprehensive.
So, in saying that, did you see any gaps from your perspective that the report seemed to miss? What we're trying to do is actually, through this webinar, invite others who perhaps haven't had a chance to have input and have other perspectives to contribute and So if you have some gaps that you've seen, it'd be good if you could give us an idea of what they might be.
Yeah, sure. One of the things that really stood out to me was this this push when we're talking about food security and we're talking about climate health, environmental health, and human health, and the relationship between them. One of the things that stood out was the relationship between livestock and perhaps methane emissions. And I think there needs to be a lot more work done on that in certain systems. My understanding is that ruminants belong on pasture, and I'm of the understanding that when a ruminant is on a pasture, and especially a perennial pasture, and is the rotations and the management is right, then it well and truly offsets any methane emissions from animals in that system. And I think that really needs to be addressed and delved into, because I think it's easy to start blaming a cow for methane emissions without looking at specific systems and saying, well, is that, it's easy to have a blanket approach across the whole farming sector when it comes to those kinds of things. What was there anything that stood out to you, Luce?
No, mostly just that. Yeah, with the
I saw the comment about diet, and I think diversity of diet is really important. I get concerned when I see the comments made about more plant-based diets being better for people and better for environment. It's not what I see when I look around at production systems. I see those production systems that are more plant focused. I see less resilience in those systems.
Yeah, and more chemicals used.
I see more chemical use. I see more. I wouldn't go as far as saying climate change.
Monoculture too, hey?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And I see more environmental pollution from those systems. That's where I start to see defoliation of trees in those around those places where we see lots of monocultures and lots of single species crops growing year after year. And I think that really it takes away the diversity of a system. So I see that as a potential issue. And I come across people from time to time that have gone from a really plant-based diet, believing that it was really good for them, and eating a lot of red meat. And I don't know whether they're eating just regenerative.
That have gone away from eating red meat, do you mean?
Yeah, that have returned to eating a lot of red meat. And I don't know whether it's organic. I know that it's regenerative. And seeing chronic illnesses disappear. So it's another, I think, space that needs to be investigated. So I don't think we can have a blanket approach about, what I'm saying is all food isn't equal.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Yeah, we certainly cover in a fair bit of depth the energy dense foods that many people are consuming as out of convenience or opportunity, or the fact that their lifestyles and their socioeconomic position doesn't allow them to make those decisions, or they think it doesn't allow them to make good nutrition decisions, and you ending up with problems within those socioeconomic areas that are based on those poor choices. So we would concur with you for sure.
Yeah.
From your perspective, what are the most critical issues that your industry needs to address? I mean, is it summed up in those things you've already said to us, or is there do we see a creeping change in the way farming is going in respect for land and so on? Are we just at the cutting edge, or is there something that needs to be more constructive done to drive this forward?
I think what comes to mind for me is that people want to know now where their food comes from. Like there's this growing awareness, like even us going into eggs, there's been this growing awareness of how do you run your eggs, you know, and how many chickens per hectare, and you know, all this stuff that I've never really kind of thought about. But I think with COVID and food shortages and all that starting to happen, people, especially our generation, are kind of questioning where's your food coming from? Where's your milk coming from? How's it produced? You know, what's in that milk, you know? And so I think there's this, just really like a big growing awareness for paddock to plate. People love it. There's such a groundswell about it. And I think if us in the architecture, us in agriculture, we're in the box seat. Like we can say, look, this is where our food's coming from. This is what we do. This is how we run our chickens, and our diversity in the system. So what the chickens are eating. And I know it's different with broad agriculture and that kind of thing, but I think that's the key for me is what's in my food, nutritionally, what's in it. Like, and having kids as well has definitely changed. What am I feeding my children? What are they, you know, from their baby food? I don't want to buy their baby food or make their baby food, but what am I putting in that? Like, where's the chicken grown, you know? And so it's just a really interesting conversation, and especially with my friends around me and how they farm and how we farm. And yeah, and not that they would probably ask me, like, I don't think they would say, oh, so how do you even farm? Like, they just wouldn't. It's like asking about what your religion is. They just wouldn't.
Yeah.
They just wouldn't do it, you know? So, yeah, that's my take on it. But, yeah.
But coming from the perspective of you in the diversity of the business you've now got with those underlying principles, how do you find that chain of custody works for you in relation to your product getting to market with your brand recognised? Is that something that you are pursuing? Is it something that you're getting recognition for?
I think that's a big part of it, and I guess that's why it's quite a tricky space to enter, and it stops a lot of people because you still need a point of difference in the market if you're going to have some kind of market share. But I guess our interest is really in human health as well, and I guess that's a big part of our selling point. We're talking to people about food and its related, human health and the benefits of it. So I think that's a big part of the marketing. In saying that, it's there's a whole lot of challenges, and we're fairly new to that part of the direct marketing for our business. And there's a whole lot of supply chain issues, as you'd be well aware of, just from couriers on the other end, and the prices are going up, almost monthly. In our own little store here in Newdigate, the bread just stopped turning up yesterday. There's no more bread coming. No. So they're setting up the baking ovens. And that's for a number of reasons, but it's, the same kind of thing that's happening, again, over and over. So there's a whole lot of challenges. At the same time, for the broadacre guys, I mean, we're still considered broadacre, but I guess for the broadacre grain growers and the chemical farmers, which is, the standard out here, that's becoming probably just as much, if not more challenging. And that's one of the reasons we're doing what we're doing, is because I wanted to get out of that. I wanted to be a price setter, and I wanted to have that relationship with customers, because that global supply issue is directly affecting the commodities as well. Whether it's wheat or barley or oats or hay, there is huge issues at the moment.
in terms of those pressures that we're all feeling, you talked about the bread scenario. What about availability of inputs from your perspective and labour and things like that? Have they become critical issues for you?
Yeah.
Yep, they are. Certainly labour is a big issue. One of our inputs for our birds was an import, and it's just not available anymore. One of the protein inputs, they just can't get it.
Yep.
So I've had to make quite radical changes in a very short space of time to adapt and find something else. One of the things it's forcing me to go more and more local, which is, it's turning out to be a better thing.
Yeah.
And thankfully I've been able to find substitutes for what we couldn't get. But yeah, it's definitely a real issue. Absolutely. The other side of our business, the cropping, the sheep and the cattle, they haven't been affected anywhere near as much. They are really kind of systems we've been looking at and focusing on for a long time. And we're making our own compost and our own biological foliar sprays and all of those kinds of things. Most of the things we need, we can actually produce on our own farm. And then we're speeding this thing up with the birds as well, because that our fertilizer regime actually pays us rather than the other way around. So there's lots of benefits, but some of these take a while to pay off, of course.
Yeah, but again, it's exploring that those diversity options with all of those principles as a foundation, which it looks a very balanced sort of operation. Okay, so finally, where do you think government intervention and policy could have the greatest impact working with industry in facilitating for food security in WA?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and you'd be well aware, and I've been aware for a long, long time. A lot of the R&D and the dollars go towards the chemical farming. It goes towards the latest, developing the latest grain, the latest technology, and the measures to control pests and soil amelioration and those things, which is important as well, and it needs to happen because we obviously need to produce tons of food. The kind of change we're talking about in systems it's a long game. It takes a long time to change systems. But what I can see is that if there was a situation where farms were smaller again and enterprises were stacked and they were very resilient systems, we would have no trouble producing the amount of food that we require. In fact, if you listen to some of Gabe Brown's talks and the likes of Joel Salatin, they say there's absolutely no problem feeding the growing population with smaller farms that stack enterprises and that have very resilient systems. So, I would like to see more investment into examining those systems. And, obviously it's the farmers that benefit out of these systems because the money really stays in the farmer's pocket, which is what the Wheat Belt Integrity Group is all about. That's why we've kept coming back to regenerative farming systems, because it seems to be the best way to help farmers farm and stay on farms and make money rather than all of their money going into other big enterprise or other big corporations. So I'd like to see more R&D into those systems that stack enterprises that explore those perennial pasture systems and cropping without chemical intervention.
Yeah.
I think that'd be really powerful to have a closer look at that, and perhaps there's a lot of knowledge gaps because it's being done in other parts of the world to a degree, and it's being done over east quite successfully. And I know in the closer to the rangelands, and further north, it's working quite well. And it seems to be harder to implement the further you go south due to climate, soil type, and things like that, and the return of native perennials and those kinds of things.
You mean like concise and...
Well, concise and some of the no-kill croppers are, having quite good success with this in the east. It's quite new here. There's a few having a red-hot crack at it and a few having success. But it would be good to broaden that, I think, and to really dive into it and to see what makes it work and how we speed this system up.
And I think I totally concur with you. It would also, there's another net winner out of that, and that's bringing back our regional diversity and regional capacity for you people, farming people in the regions, as stewards of the land. And that's a part of the currency that's yet to be tapped, for sure.
Yes, and what I'm realizing more and more is that as soon as we really zero in on human health from an agricultural production point of view, the more our systems improve environment and climate. The two go hand in hand. If we're really serious about human health and looking at the health of soil, will straight away our environment and hence our climate improve. The more I go into this, the more I'm seeing the correlation between the two.
Yeah.
That's terrific. Thank you very much for your involvement tonight and presenting those views. That's really helpful. Thanks for making the time available. I know you're very, very busy people, and seeing that diversity in your business, I can understand you don't see the kids that often, Nick. That's part of the deal.
That's his excuse anyway.
And I bet you get busted for it all the time.
Yeah, he gets a few, what time do you call this? Definitely.
All right.
Yeah. And thanks very much for inviting us to be part of it. It's been an honour.
No, thank you.
Thank you both. Thank you both. Pleasure.
Great to hear from you. Now, secondly, we have Phil Harding from Ellica, just out of Albany, who's a vegetable producer. What we'd like to find from Phil is the pressures or the issues that he's finding in relation to their vegetable production system in the regional southwest of Western Australia. So welcome, Phil, and thanks for joining us. You'd like to tell us a bit about your business, please?
Well, I guess in the scheme of things, we're pretty small. It's only my wife and I, so we're owner operators. We started from scratch, so we didn't have a heritage or anything like that we inherited. We didn't really intend to be in the vegetable industry. It kind of happened by accident. We started on a very small scale as a bit of a sideline to just working ordinary jobs. But yeah, just literally it just grew from that to the point where we went full time, and that's all we've been doing for the last about 15 years.
Wow.
We predominantly grow sweet corn. It's our main product. We just have a roadside stall because we're on a busy road to the beach. So we have a roadside stall on a box type system where we just grow a range of other summer vegetables and fruit as well for that.
Do you sell into any retail outlets at all, or is it all roadside sales with your fruit and veg?
We don't sell it. We don't sell to anybody locally in Albany. But all the sweet corn goes to Perth, so it just goes through the central markets in Canning Vale through an agent. Usual story, and of course ends up, I presume, pretty much in the independent retailers and food service sector.
What were your thoughts in relation to those questions? Does it adequately reflect the key issues, do you think?
I think obviously I can only talk from my own perspective and experience, but yeah, I think everything's pretty well covered. There's certain points that I would sort of perhaps highlight or draw more attention to, but that again is based on my personal situation rather than a broader knowledge of the industry.
Do you think any of those appeared high enough in those tables that were representative, or were some of them more important to you and you thought there could have been more weight put to them.
Yeah, I think there could be more weight. There's a number of things, really. I guess there could be more weight upon, but you can't, of course, put them all on the top priority. I don't think there's anything particularly new. I think they're all issues that have probably been going on for decades and decades, in a sort of just sort of tickling away, little things happening, but not really brought to any sort of government attention in a big way. I personally think that access to land, and the pressure on land use was one of the most important and one of the most significant issues. And again, like that has been happening probably almost since Federation, really, because the demand for land has always been growing, and good land is close to to population. It's obviously in demand for farming, but then of course it's also in demand for housing and lots of other uses. And so I think it has been going on for a long, long time, but I think that because the land use issue is so big, I think it affects a lot of other issues as well. So, for example, things like transport costs. Obviously, the further away production is from where the market is, the transport costs in both directions rises. So, I think that land use issue, if governments had in the past and would now put greater protections around good horticultural land that's highly productive, that has good water, etc., to the point where it's basically untouchable, I think that it would help some of the other issues going forward. Does that make sense?
Yes, absolutely. And we've seen that in all the arable areas that have disappeared around all of our major points of population, to the detriment of the horticulture and agriculture industries, who then have to, as they are very adaptive, manage in perhaps a less comfortable environment or a more expensive environment. So we understand fully. Is there anything critical that you think is important for your particular industry from the support you get from government or peak industry body?
Well, I personally don't feel we get any support from government whatsoever. In fact, I find my own experience has been the opposite. Whenever we've had an issue come up, whether we're trying to talk to every level of government, local, state, or perhaps even federal, it's hard to even get a response, let alone an acknowledgement of the problem, let alone a solution that actually helps. I guess we have the most to do with local government, our local council, and pretty much the attitude that we've got for years is that they wish we didn't exist. It would be much easier for them if we weren't here. All we sort of do is effectively place demands on them and their resources, and they basically, the impression we get is that they don't want us here at all.
And that's unfortunate, because particularly around Albany, where the small landholders have developed into quite a conglomerate of small industry supporting the region, that they don't value. That's an interesting position for sure.
Yeah, I mean, they'll obviously pay lip service in the media. They'll support in the media. They will acknowledge that there is a great little industry, and they will sort of, like I said, pay lip service to it. But when it comes down to brass tacks, it's sort of too hard, and the actual real issues, they don't want to support you at all. They're far more interested. I think ultimately it's, down here in this region, because most growers are actually very small. So we're not big employers. Like I said, ourselves, we don't employ anyone except ourselves. Some of the other growers might only employ 2 or 3 or 5 people. And so we're not seen as a big revenue raiser for we're not a big job provider, and not a big revenue raiser for the government. And so they far would prefer to favour tourism and other sort of bigger industries where they can get bigger numbers, basically. They don't recognise, and I don't think they even know. I don't think local governments or state governments probably even have the data that shows how much we contribute to the economy, perhaps not directly with jobs, but by turnover, by supporting other jobs. We don't employ anyone, but through what we do, we would basically pay a truck driver for 3 or 4 months of the year. We're putting hundreds of thousands of dollars into local businesses and the local economy. But I don't think local governments I don't think they even understand that. They certainly don't value it.
Yeah. Do you have off-farm income, or is the farm your sole income source?
It's our main income source. My wife is a teacher, and so she does a bit of relief teaching. But it's a minor part. She doesn't work full time at all.
But that demonstrates that the way you operate, so that you can exist and be an important part of the community. So that's good. Thanks very much for that. All right. Well, thank you for joining us today, and we'll put all of this together, and we'll be back in touch with you for anything else that we need. So thanks very much.
No worries at all. Welcome.
Cheers. Thank you. So, Peter, what conclusions have we been able to draw from these initial findings?
I think one of the key constraints that's emerged is the failure of government to adopt an holistic food systems approach. In today's modern food supply chains, there is a high element of mutual independence between food producers, between food processors, the various wholesalers and distributors, and indeed between the retailers. What we actually need here, if we're going to achieve greater food security, is an holistic whole of government approach that seeks to resolve the problems and constraints across not one government department, but indeed across multiple government departments. And indeed, if we take the experience from the UN and from the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, while there's only one SDG that specifically looks at food, SDG 2, we actually see that food is embedded within just about every other SDG. And if we really are going to then move towards a more sustainable climate, a more sustainable planet, and reduce some of the environmental impacts that are associated with climate change, then we have to be able to address the food industry. If we do not address the food industry holistically and generically, then we're not going to be able to achieve any of the issues associated with addressing climate change and or indeed with global food security. The role of government then is not only one of legislation and compliance, it's also about supporting the industry and providing the various financial incentives that will actually encourage and drive industry to be more sustainable. We must acknowledge, however, that government is only one of the players within this space. Most of the emphasis will come not from government, who effectively provide a desirable enabling environment, but indeed even from industry itself. And it's here that we need to acknowledge the role of industry in terms of things like policy advocacy, in the promotion and education of consumers, and particularly within Australia, the huge advantage that we have through the various research and development of activities that are provided by organisations like Horticulture Innovation, by GRDC, by Meat and Livestock and others. The role of industry is also paramount, including and enhancing technology transfer and in facilitating market access. When we talk about the domestic supply of food, then yes, we need to acknowledge that within the state of Western Australia, we are in a peculiar and particular situation where, although we are major exporters of grain, of meat, of fresh fruit and vegetables and fish, consumers, as I said before, don't eat wheat, they eat bread. And so the product must therefore be processed, it must be manufactured. And we have a weakness within the WA sector around the food processing industry. And as a result of that, approximately 46% of the food that is consumed within WA is imported. And I actually expect or anticipate that this would in fact be much, much higher, because the only figures that we could find to be able to estimate the amount of food that is imported within Western Australia were dated 2009. So I suspect that that percentage is in fact a great deal higher. The concern is that because we have so much food then being imported into the state of Western Australia, there is the ongoing potential for supply chain disruptions, as we've seen each and every time the Nullarbor becomes flooded, with the result of the higher rainfall that is occurring within central Australia. That's also going to result or potentially result in impacts, as we've seen again post-COVID, with supply chain disruptions to the food processing industry, and of course to supply chain disruptions that come about through things like food safety. So there is a really strong demand at a state level to actually support and to encourage local food producers and local food processing operations. It is important also to acknowledge the constraints with this study. We have not looked at the food demand and consumption side. What we do need to think about here, and in particular, is around things like diet and nutrition. We've not attempted to address that with this study. We've acknowledged the fact that we know from our food security and our food choices that consumers are making too many bad choices about what they eat. But we haven't attempted in this study to address that. That's another entirely independent study, but it's equally important to achieving this holistic outcome of improved food security for the state of Western Australia. And I think that's what we're starting to see here. There are multiple aspects that we need to address, that we need to bring together to reinforce the need for an holistic, whole of government food systems approach to address food security and indeed food insecurity within the state of Western Australia.
So from this process, we've seen what the stakeholder data has told us. We've heard from a couple of participants on the interim findings, their industry perspective, and how they are managing their businesses. We'd now like to invite you to provide additional input before we finalise the report. We've got a period to the 31st of March, or a little bit after if needed, for you to come back to us with any feedback you have in terms of constraints you're finding in your ability to meet the opportunities of our future food security. And we have listed there an email address, survey@perthnrm.com, for you to respond to us. We'd really appreciate that if you want to take the opportunity to provide any additional feedback to us. The next steps in the project are we'll finalise the input to the report in April and publish it in early May, we expect. The plan is to then work with stakeholder groups to consolidate their data in relation to their supply chain to argue for their key issues should they wish. We expect collaboration between supply chain partners to press government on the need for change. So we'd like to thank you for joining us today, and please remind again for you to provide any extra feedback to our email at survey@perthnrm.com by the end of March if possible. Thank you.